The USA and Britain are attacking the Houthis in Yemen, who in return damage a submarine communication cable. Lebanon is in a state of collapse due to Hezbollah's actions, and concerns arise over a potential ISIS resurgence in Syria. I'm Shoshani, and this is what happened this week in our neighborhood. The situation in Syria has indeed deteriorated significantly in recent years, with the country becoming a notable hotspot for various terrorist activities, including the presence of groups like ISIS. While most of the media is focused on the pro-Iranian militias operating in Syria, which Israel attacks on a regular basis in our neighborhood, it's often the quiet ones you have to watch. And ISIS is apparently planning a comeback. When and how? To answer that, we have to pay close attention to the Kurds and the autonomy they established in northern Syria. When you are a threatened nation like the Kurds, you tend to feel the pulse of the area very well. So when they publish news about a comeback of ISIS, the information should be taken very seriously. The Kurds fear the return of ISIS more than anyone. After all, they know exactly what ISIS is about, since the Kurdish fighters contributed the most important part to the fighting on the ground against the Islamic State, or ISIS, between 2014 and 2017, while the US provided them training, equipment, and air support. We can safely assume that the Kurds have an interest in publishing the information about the recovery of ISIS to ensure that they will not be abandoned and will continue to win American patronage in Syria and neighboring Iraq as well. Unfortunately, ISIS does not currently have many enemies other than the Kurds in Syria. Russia has pledged to strengthen and rehabilitate Assad's army, but as it seems, it is now deeply mired in the Ukrainian mud. The worn-out Syrian army has been severely affected by the horrific economic situation in the country. Most of the soldiers do not receive a salary sufficient to live on. And then there are the pro-Iranian militias, who are not engaged in the war against ISIS at all. The ISIS cells that have survived since 2018 are using the Syrian desert to hide. These are hundreds of kilometers of desolate desert in the east of the country. This area is almost uninhabited, and the conditions there are difficult to live in, especially in the summer, which makes it difficult for any army to enter it. ISIS squads take advantage of the fact that the desert borders Iraq and Jordan, which allows them to smuggle weapons and carry out occasional attacks against the Syrian army. Since the end of the war against ISIS, a huge camp has been held with tens of thousands of detainees from the families of ISIS fighters. In the camp called Elul, in the eastern district of Al-Hasaka, live the women and children of the Mujahideen, the ISIS terrorists who were mostly eliminated, and others are held in custody in Iraq. In the women's camp, there is a regime of fanatical terror that guards the members of the Islamic State in terms of ideology. The camp is guarded from the outside by Kurdish fighters, but the camp is too big and the Kurds claim that they have difficulty controlling it. The children in the camp are growing up and may become the next generation of ISIS because they receive a radical education from the women locked in the camp. Just to understand how challenging this is, last summer, the Kurdish forces conducted a series of military operations in the camp itself to capture ISIS terrorists who had infiltrated it. Some of the attacks reported by the Kurds recently are actually a revenge response by ISIS to the operations. During the operations in the camp, the Kurds were surprised to discover terrorist tunnels, a familiar phenomenon in our region. Dozens of ISIS operatives were arrested and 2 senior officials who infiltrated the camp were killed. Some argue that ideology cannot be eliminated. This talking point is often being used to claim that the terror organization Hamas cannot be defeated. But ISIS is an example that terrorism can be subdued or at least significantly weakened. Look, until 7 years ago, ISIS controlled a huge area, which included 2 large cities, and after the war became a small and persecuted organization whose people were hiding in the desert. But in the case of ISIS, the fawda, chaos in Syria, works in its favor, and it may come back big. The forces fighting against ISIS are steadily weakening. The Kurds fear that the American patronage they receive is only temporary, and that Turkey is awaiting for the day it can take over the areas of Kurdish autonomy. As the situation in Syria worsens, and the power of the central government in Damascus continues to erode, we unfortunately see more and more signs of the resurgence of ISIS. Will the terrorist organization succeed in breaking through the borders of the Syrian desert? Only time will tell. But one thing the West has got to understand: you can't negotiate peace with Islamic terrorists, and here's why. The West sees a peace agreement as the end of the war, in contrast to Islam, which sees an agreement with infidels, quote-unquote, as a step towards the renewal of the war under improved conditions. The West believes in give-and-take negotiations, while Islam practices subduing the opponent. And if you want to successfully defeat terrorism, you have to understand how they think in our neighborhood. And now, let me take you to another street in our neighborhood, Yemen. 4 underwater communications cables between Saudi Arabia and Djibouti, an African country, have been struck out of commission in recent months, presumably as a result of attacks by Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels. The successful targeting of the 4 cables marks a serious disruption of communications between Europe and Asia. Most of the immediate harm will be absorbed by the Gulf states and India. Now, the details are important, so bear with me as we analyze the significance, because in this case, the devil and the Houthis are in the details. You see, all of this is happening right after the armies of the United States and Great Britain attacked about 18 targets of the Houthi rebels in Yemen, as a response to a series of attacks carried out by the terrorist organization against vessels in the Red Sea and the Straits of Aden. The attacks were carried out by the help of other countries such as Australia, Bahrain, Canada, Denmark, the Netherlands, and New Zealand. The targets attacked were underground weapons storage facilities, missile storage facilities, warehouses for unmanned aerial vehicles, air defense systems, radars, and a helicopter. The U.S. Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, said after the wave of attacks that their goal was to erode the military capabilities of the Houthis and reduce their ability to carry out attacks against American and international vessels in the Red Sea and Egypt's Bab el-Mandab Straits. We will not hesitate to carry out more attacks, Austin said. We will continue to make it clear to the Houthis that they will bear the consequences if they do not stop their illegal attacks, which harm the economics of the Middle East, cause environmental damage, and disrupt the delivery of humanitarian aid to Yemen and other countries, the defense minister added. And now, let's focus on another important arena in our neighborhood, Lebanon. Once a thriving majority Christian state, thriving with prosperity, that used to be known as the Paris of the Middle East, Lebanon has plummeted over recent decades into instability and economic ruin. A brutal 15-year-old civil war, floods of refugees, foreign interventions, widespread corruption, and incompetent leadership have transformed Lebanon from its height in the mid-20th century, with the Christian population declining from over 60% to just a third of the population today. Fast forward to today, as a result of Hezbollah's aggression towards Israel, the streets of southern Lebanon villages stand empty as residents flee the tense border towns. Media footage shows the impact of conflict as families face displacement for weeks on end without work or care for their children. A tragic situation all too familiar to Israelis. So while Hezbollah drums up hollow resistance credentials, the people of Lebanon pay in emptied streets, miserable children, and multiple displacements at the hands of an unchecked military proxy, as the country reaps the turmoil directly sown by Hezbollah's brazen hostilities across the border. In recent weeks, more and more calls have been heard from residents of southern Lebanon who are opposed to a wider war. Many ask themselves why they must pay in blood and suffer losses without a convincing reason. The dire situation in Lebanon only worsens these sentiments. Residents already face massive economic crisis and only receive a few hours of electricity per day from the state, relying instead on private generators dependent on diesel fuel. This diesel shortage has now even forced the government internet provider to halt services in parts of Beirut, cutting off another essential service for Lebanese civilians already living through these terrible conditions. The crippled infrastructure and unraveling public services add to calls for avoiding further escalations with Israel that could bring even more suffering. This means that neighborhoods are often left in a complete mess for hours without electricity or internet. Meanwhile, residents are forced to pay exorbitant rates for services like private generators, with operators changing frequently as the economic crisis continues to spiral. Lebanon is already mired in economic, social, and political crisis. A potential war with Israel could further destabilize the country across the board. Without basic necessities like power and connectivity, while facing rapidly inflating costs of living, the Lebanese people grow weary of conflict and desire stability and normalcy. These sentiments were echoed by the former Lebanese Prime Minister, who said in an interview with Al Jazeera last week that Lebanon cannot withstand another war. Having lived through the devastation of past conflicts, he believes that the country currently lacks the necessary security infrastructure to endure the damage. With crippled services like electricity and internet, a shortage of basic needs, and continuing political unrest, the former prime minister reinforced that Lebanon stands unprepared for the pressures of new hostilities as civilians yearn to regain stability in their daily lives. According to him, Lebanon is suffering from crises that do not allow it to wage war. That's it for this week. I'm Mati Shoshani. Please continue to follow us to find out what God is doing in our neighborhood. Like we always say, you can't understand this part of the world without understanding what happens in Israel. And you can't understand Israel without understanding the neighborhood.